good job, especially when the news is prepared presentation. However, I think we need help with continuous help. So what I'm just referring to is what to do when we are necessary and we have to be in the moment.
So, considering your experiences of public speaking, I believe that's going to be, if you walk our students through your experiences, I believe it's going to be helpful for them. So, without any further ado, I pass it over to you.
And I will talk a little bit about how I learned how to speak in public towards the end. But I'd love for this also to be interactive and to also answer any questions that you have. Did you share my CV with them?
I did not.
You did not. So I'll give a quick synopsis. So you can tell I'm an American. But when I was 3 years old, I said to my parents that I wanted to move overseas. And I guess I had a friend who was Japanese or Mexican. And I said, let's go to either Japan or Mexico, but I'm not staying in America. And that's kind of been the defining feature of my life, is the passion to explore and understand the world and engage with it through business. And I looked at 3 possible careers. Many of you will also be thinking about what kind of career you'll have after you're graduating. I thought about diplomacy. I thought about academics. And my parents kept saying, try banking. And I thought, oh, I don't care about money. I don't need to go work at a bank. But what I didn't recognize at the time was that banking would really give me my dream, which was an international career. And so what I've done today, and hopefully I'll answer any questions you have, is I've created a list of the things I learned about having an international career, and then also about how you go up in an organization because you can publicly speak. Okay, so I hope that will be of interest to you. And just to maybe explain, through my banking career, I lived in 10 countries. I moved my family 22 times to different houses. I, in total, spent about 14 years in Asia. And I also spent about 10 years in Europe. And then I've also spent half a year in Latin America and half a year in Cairo, Egypt. And so part of it is just the only place I really didn't go was South America. So hopefully that gives you also some things to think about. So I think I wanted to organize this in terms of some tips when you're thinking about, what do you do next? How do you find a career if you're interested in having it be international? And so I basically have sort of 8 tips for you. The first one that I found was really important when working in my field was actually developing transferable skills. What do I mean by that? They're sort of broad-based skills that enable you to be effective no matter where you're placed. I particularly think every person who goes into the business or government world should have a little bit of accounting background. So if you guys have not taken an accounting class, you might not because of the area you're in. It's actually really helpful because when you're looking at how the business is doing, you can understand, okay, are we making money? Are we not making money? That sort of thing. The second is to assimilate or understand at least contract law. Now, even when you guys are hiring people, let's say you're working at a company and you need to hire a media agency or an ad agency, understanding how to actually do contracting is actually a basic skill that I think is really useful. But also generally understanding economics, business, and communications, how are messages deployed into the world. Those are all very transferable skills. So regardless of which country you're in, you can use those anywhere. Does that make sense? So they're not specific, they're transferable in every context where you work. The second tip is to really be a student of culture and countries. So some of you may go, I've always wanted to go, I'm going to make this up, to Singapore or Dubai. If you're truly interested in having an international career, being a student of that country and its business culture, its communications culture, what works, what doesn't work, can make a huge difference to your success when you land. And I had a problem when I first got to the Philippines. So I worked in the Philippines because the culture was so different to mine. So for example, the way I would communicate messages was not landing with my team. And I call it sort of the cobweb effect. You know, if you ever walk into a basement or an attic and you hit a cobweb and it doesn't feel good and it's dark and slimy and you're a bit surprised. That is sort of what cultural differences feel like. You can't understand them. You don't know where it came from, but something didn't feel right about the interaction. And there's a great group of books called Culture Shock. I don't know if any of you have ever seen them on some of the... If you were to say, hey, I'd really love to go work in Dubai for a while, I'm just making this up, get one of those books because it will explain to you what's different about how they do business so that you can succeed. And I'll give you one of my my errors. So one morning I was the leader of the banking group in the Philippines, and I was realizing that the policy said people should be in the office by 8 a.m. But people were coming in closer to 10 a.m. Now, I was getting lots of reasons why. Traffic, school drop-off, you name it. And again, a communication problem. I said, hey, I noticed our policy says 8 a.m. I'd like to ask all of you to come to the office by 8 a.m. How do you think that went down? It created a total crisis. Now, as an American, that would be a very normal thing to ask. But as a Filipino, it didn't work at all. What do you think the problem was?
And how it was communicated to them
Yeah.
made it kind of like a threat, almost maybe.
Any other ideas?
It was new to them. They had never been told that before.
Yeah, although I think everyone knew the policy. So the real issue was that in the Filipino culture, you don't say things directly. You say them indirectly. So I realized that the best way to communicate with my team was to mention to my secretary that perhaps people could come in a little bit earlier. Our policy says this. And then she would backdoor the information to everyone. So my mistake culturally was thinking that they would assimilate the information directly. But the culture created a situation where I made them feel ashamed. So how effective was my request to come in at 8? Completely ineffective, right? So be a student of the culture because the norms of how people work, you know, how they communicate with each other matter when you're in business. And there's a very good book called Culture Map. It's a big yellow book. The professor's name is Erin. I can't remember her last name. But she talks about these cultural differences and in a very easy to understand way that gives you the ability to go into any culture and assess how they operate. The third tip I have is to master English, both in speaking and in writing. Now, you guys have an advantage. In many of the countries I've operated in, English is really the second or the third language. But when you are very fluent in writing and in speaking, it removes the barriers when people are interacting with you. And what I found as a young woman in business was people would look at me and see tall, American, young woman, and they would have a credibility gap automatically. But because I could articulate myself, they started to pay attention. So it would be shock for the first 5 minutes when I would walk into an international room because of the, whoa, what is this American doing here? But very quickly I had to use language and the ability to communicate to basically get them to understand that I had a credibility to be in the room. And it may be the same with you. When you go to a place, they may go, oh, who's this Pakistani girl or boy? What can they really offer me? So your language fluency and your language professionalism will set you apart and really give you that immediate credibility. They're still going to have the shock for the first 5 minutes, but eventually they're going to start to listen to you. Fourth, is learn to speak in public and learn, what I found, and I don't know how much you do this here, but when I was a brand new businesswoman, I hated speaking in public, particularly if it wasn't a prepared presentation. I would get nervous, my hands would sweat, I'd lose my words, I didn't know what to say. So what did I do? I realized this was going to be a limitation to my future progression, because the more senior you get, the more you have to speak in public. So I devised a strategy. It was actually 2 strategies. The first part of the strategy was to find what I call soft opportunities to speak. So for example, in my case, if there was an opportunity to lead a group where there was no professional downside, I would take the leadership of the group just so I could practice. Or for example, if I had an opportunity to speak like with a group of friends or at a conference that had nothing to do with work, I would take the opportunity to do that. Why? Because what I found was most difficult was the ability to order my thoughts in a way that was authentic to me. Because ultimately, the way you connect with a listener is that sense of empathy and authenticity. If they think that you're being truthful, that you are delivering a message that is, honest and interesting, they'll connect with you. But I remember starting with tons of papers, all my thoughts written out. Then I had, slides in the back. I just didn't know what my style was, the way that I made it best. Since then, I've realized that bullet points are the easiest thing for me because it gives me a prompt, but then I more or less know what I want to talk about with the prompt. If I write every word out, it comes across as wooden, not very authentic. So that was the first thing, was just finding my own style so I could connect with audiences of any culture. The second was understanding that there's different kinds of speaking. There's giving a toast, there's giving a presentation, there's talking to a group of people, there's facilitating a conversation with people, there was giving a formal speech, right? So I kind of put all those different kinds of speaking opportunities, and then I would try and get good at one at a time. Does that make sense? So I felt most comfortable in the beginning with PowerPoints. And then I grew to be very comfortable at facilitating a conversation. And then I grew to being more confident talking to a group of people like you, etc. But here's one quick tip. I realized my nerves were irrational. Why? Because I could talk to each one of you individually with no problem. But something about the group made me so nervous. So I realized that if I just think about speaking to each of you as if I'm having one-on-one conversation, I could go from one person to 200 people to 5,000 people, and it didn't matter. Does that make sense? I mean, you've all been in that situation where you go to a cocktail party, you can talk to anyone, right? All right. Fifth, One of the easiest ways to have an international career is to seek out employment with an international company here in Pakistan. Because you will get used to the working culture, you will get used, and it feels very different, right? I worked for an international bank, and when I would talk to my local colleagues in any country, they would say working for an international bank was so different than working for a local bank. Because the headquarters culture is somehow coming into the country, right? So it's again an easy way. So rather than saying, hey, I want to go already to Dubai, find a company here that has an opportunity for you and get assimilated into how they do business and learn to be successful in that business here. And then you may have more success if you do want to eventually move overseas.
Sometimes when you have a group of people and they don't comply with your opinions, especially when you have a management position, so you get recognized.
Yeah, you can get very nervous, right? Especially when there's a power dynamic of senior and junior, and you're the young person and they're the old person. It can be really intimidating. So my definition of networking is, it's an opportunity you can't see today. So the reason to network is because if you didn't have that conversation, you wouldn't know that there was an opportunity for you. So I'm very, let's call it, I learned to be strategic when I network. If I go to, let's call it a club, and this might be like, I'll give you an example. In many countries, there are chambers of commerce, right? I would look at the website of who were the members of the Chamber of Commerce, and then if they had a list of the invitations, I would see who's going, and then I would make my top 3 list of who I wanted to make an intentional opportunity to meet. So for example, if you went to a Chamber of Commerce and you said, I would really love to work with this communications company or in their PR, and somebody is representing the company, come prepared to meet them with 1 or 2 good questions. Do you see what I mean? So it's completely changed a chance encounter to a strategic encounter. And what do you lose? If you end up not having an opportunity with them, you didn't lose anything. But often they'll say, I can't help you, but I have an idea for you. And they'll give you 1 or 2 additional ideas. So networking is an opportunity you can't see today. Now, you do have to be prepared. You have to be a little bit courageous. But it's really a lot of fun when you start to do it, actually. And also, you might want to be prepared to has anybody ever heard of an elevator pitch? Oh, you have? Okay, what is it?
So it's like a very small idea of what you're about, or what your company is about, or what you're really basically pitching.
Exactly. So the idea of an elevator pitch is if you are in an elevator and you have 3 minutes to get to the bottom floor and you happen to walk in and it's the CEO of your dream company, what are you going to leave with them in those 3 minutes? Does that make sense? So the other thing when you're networking is to prepare, who are you? Now, I have had many elevator rides where I made a mess of it. Hi, who are you? Oh, I'm nobody, right? That's what you kind of want to say because you're intimidated by the seniority. But when I was a young banker, I sat on the same floor as all the big executives. I was very junior. And in the beginning, I was so quiet and unassuming and tried to just keep my head down. And then I kept getting stuck in the elevator. And it was amazing. After a while, they got to know me. They became very human, They weren't this tall, big, senior person. And interestingly, for the next 10 years, my elevator conversations led to my next jobs in all those 10 years from that one floor. Because I got the courage to create a relationship with them and also say, who am I about? So think about confidence. Hi, my name is Kristine. So nice to meet you. I hear you work in this department. I'm working on this right now. This is what I do, right? That's all you have to do. It seems so easy, right? But a lot of us just stay quiet because it's packed and it's whatever. Don't miss the opportunity. So when you network, again, in the strategy of developing your network, what are the clubs where you will get access to some of these companies? What are the chambers of commerce? What are the programs? Or they might have talent programs for young people. They might have scholarships for young people. Plot out multiple opportunities where it might give you that opportunity to make an inroad into the company you'd really like to work for. Okay, number 7. Never stop learning and keeping yourself relevant. So what I found in my world, and it's probably similar in your world, is that the external environment is changing all the time, right? So now we have AI. We didn't have AI before. We might have something new, right? So I found that there was a proportion of my time that I always needed to sort of think, what's coming and how do I make myself relevant in it? How can I be articulate about it? How can I have a few talking points or opinions about the topic? And how do I improve my skills? So I'll give you an example. When I lived in Switzerland, you might have heard of the crypto industry, right? Well, already about 7 years ago, Switzerland was really sort of the country that was thinking deeply about this question, about blockchain technology, about the use of smart contracts for different equations, etc. And on the one side, I could have said, this is scary, I don't understand it, but I realized nobody understood it. So actually, I just kind of created like, hey, there's this meetup going on. I'm going to go listen to what they say. Here's this seminar where somebody's speaking who's an expert. And that got me, with just a little effort, really articulate about it and competent about it, to the point where I was actually ahead of most of my peers who weren't taking the same amount of time. And so whatever that is in your industry, right? Think about what's changing. Why is it changing? It might be social media. It might be whatever it might be. But how do you stay at the forefront of those topics? Because you will be more marketable. If you say, hey, I understand and I've used, I don't know, I'm making this up, ChatGPT, and you can give some really concrete examples, you might be more attractive than somebody who hasn't done that, right? So keep yourself always learning and always relevant. And then finally, if you end up having an international career that goes beyond the borders of your country, right, where you and your family move overseas, make sure you have a movable marriage, right? So if I give you one piece of advice, it would be always make sure that you choose a good spouse. Because it's typically your job, it might be your job that's taking you, and that spouse may or may not be so enthusiastic about leaving their country and everything that's common to them. So the first thing is to choose a spouse wisely, but then secondly, to also think, how can we make this work for both of us? And ultimately for your children too. So have a movable life. And there's many good books on how to do this. One I like is How to Have a Movable Marriage. It was written by a Canadian ambassador. And let me give you one example of the sort of conflicts you end up having when you move overseas. When you land in your new country and you're starting to get into your new job, you find it very taxing because you have to learn the new job, but you also have to prove your credibility because they're going to say, why is this Pakistani person coming to take a job that somebody locally could do? So you have a gap in terms of your credibility that you have to work harder than everybody else in those first 6 months. Now, think about your family. You're working harder and they're having to assimilate to a new country. Wow, that's like divergent priorities. So then you have to work harder to get your family settled. So there's lots of strategies that this book talked about that really helped me when I made a mess of one of my moves. Basically, I didn't unpack my closet for about a year. And I got very good advice, which is you are not settled in your job until your family is settled. And because our house was a mess and that I just didn't have time for it, there were reasons. It was the financial crisis of 2009, but still, I should have said, no, I have to get my family settled first. And I didn't do that. So understanding the tips and the tricks of doing that, and there's lots of good books out there to help you do that. So in short, I would say be skilled, be adaptable, and be adventurous. So I'll pause and see if there's questions. Thank you.
It was really nice of sharing. The two things that I really appreciate is networking and how it happens. And also I had this experience of moving and having a movable family. Like I am from Peshawar.
Yeah.
So this is my 6th year over here. So we always, like earlier when I got a PhD scholarship to Germany. So it was very new for me and also for my wife.
Wow.
And we had kids. So we had to really find a way to, because for my wife it was even more difficult
Yes.
than for me because I was a student.
You had something to do all day.
And also I had, so I was already known in this society, so for her moving in was really difficult, and German society is also tough.
I've lived there, I know.
And so we tried to find ways that we can spend more time together, and you always have to adjust, like move and also get into contact with people with whom you work, like students and others.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important. It's really good that you've mentioned it. Like even having partners staying here, like we made decisions when I went to the US. So my family didn't go because it was too much for them.
Yeah.
So I visited back, and so I think it's very important.
It's fair.
And especially networking, you use, and also you talked about like English language. And it's also important that you know how to speak. You speak really well. Not that you speak English, but there are Americans so who speak really quickly because it's the way you speak in the US. It's easy. And it's also for us also, South Asians, they learn their own Oxford diction and then they just move through it.
Yes.
So I think it's also good when you are talking to people, if people are getting it or not.
Yeah.
Like they might know the language, but they might not know the accent.
Yeah, and it's very important. I mean, I'll give you one example. I had a boss who was Australian, and he moved from Australia to Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Chinese were more used to a British accent. I can't tell you the number of meetings we were in where he was rushing with a very heavy accent, and the Chinese were just nodding, but not understanding. That's a failed interaction, right? So he should have softened his accent. He should have slowed down. He should have checked in with the people to make sure they were understanding what he said. Because you're right, the diction is different in each country. Yeah.
And in Pakistan, we actually grew up learning British English. So
It doesn't work in Britain even. Yeah, a friend of mine, so he was my batchmate. We did our masters back in 1990, and he went to England. He was a philosophy major.
Yeah.
And he said that I went there. He came back after a year and he said, I was going somewhere and I asked about the street and address, and I addressed an older guy very politely, and he heard me, and then he said, that way, and young man, speak English. This is not the age of Shakespeare.
Ah, okay.
I want to go
Yes.
there. So
Yes.
that's also when you are not in a culture, you really don't understand,
Yeah.
especially in the English speaking world.
Yes.
Because I had a lot of difficulty in the US to understand in the beginning here or to go.
Yes.
So I didn't get to go. And they were
Yes.
just standing in front of me. You get there, you know?
Yeah, because we would say takeaway, for example.
Yeah, but anyway, the accent is like, you have
Yes.
to really understand that. Yeah.
It's very true. The other thing, just to mention it, is formality levels are different in countries. Here, I perceive you have a slightly higher formality with people. In some parts of America, it's very low formality. So understanding, even for me as an American now returning to my country, sometimes I'm like, these people are like hitting each other on the back like they're best friends and they just met. I don't understand. The formality is so low because I've been in the international business world. So it's understanding all of those. You're kind of grasping the cultural nuance as you learn to assimilate in the country.
Well, thank you, Ms. Braden. I wanted to ask a question that I believe is going to be especially helpful for our students. So in my experience, students, especially even when they do class presentations, they get anxious about the Q&A session. Especially when you have this idea, well, what if I'm asked a question I do not know the answer? That kind of thing. And that actually becomes intense when you are doing kind of formal presentation. So, for example, in a conference, a seminar, a workshop, etc. So I was wondering how you would respond to that question.
What I've done before is really, I feel most comfortable when I prepare well, and I think about what are some of the questions they can actually potentially ask me. I have since found over the years I now over-prepare, but I still over-prepare because I don't want to be in that situation. So, and I tend to try and make it logical in my own head so that if somebody asks me a question, like I just had to give a discussion on environmental, social, and governance policies in the European Union. And to be honest, I didn't really have it clear in my head what I wanted to say. So what I ultimately did is I read all the materials that were relevant for that. And then I thought, what are some of the key points I want to be making? So I had to go like the extra step and not just know the context or the content, but I also had to think about, what do I think about this, right? What are the key points I want to get across? And interestingly, it was a panel discussion. And of course, we got a question from the audience. And because I had already had that clear in my head, I was able to answer the question. So I think know your content, but go a little bit further and think about what are the key points if anyone were to ask you, because I find that then makes it much easier to answer the Q&A. Of course, you can always be what I would say flat-footed with a question and you don't know. Sometimes when you're in that situation, you can say, I don't know, let me just think about it for a minute. And then you have to sort in your head, what am I going to say? And that can be very legitimate. It's also understanding how to pause, right? So that you have a moment to think. My dad does this very well. Have you ever heard of the pregnant pause? Yeah, maybe it's American saying. But the idea is you take control of the pause. So when somebody asks you the question, you kind of nod. I'm thinking about it. And that gives you a moment to get your thoughts in order. And then obviously everybody's wondering, when is she going to speak? But then you can say, I've thought about it, and here's what I would like to say. So it creates a sense of anxiety for the listener because you're silent, but it gives you control. And typically, it's very effective in making a big point. Yeah.
When you're talking about transferable skills, what are the top most significant transferable skills apart from accounting that would help internationally?
So I always think about, business operates in every country according to a series of constraints, okay? So I actually like to read the Wikipedia page of a country. Seems sort of strange, right? But because I've been to so many countries now, I understand how to kind of quickly assess, okay, what's the size of this economy? What legal infrastructure are they operating on? What regulatory considerations are there? In your world, there are regulators that are regulating communications activity, right? What have they been saying in the press? So what are the regulatory constraints? What's allowed, what's not allowed? What are those constraints in that culture? You'll know Pakistan best, but it's usually only 20% more for another country, right? So it's trying to understand the differences. What are the tax structures in the country? Because all of our communications are taxed, for example. Because then when you're trying to say, how am I going to operate in this country? You can use those parameters to almost ground yourself, if that makes sense, and then figure out what would be unique for me to bring to this country and to the businesses in this country. I'll give you an example to make this real. I was in Asia for 14 years, and I learned, because it was a fast-growing region, how to spot opportunities and how to grow businesses. When they asked me to move to London, everyone thought I was crazy because they said, there's no growth in Europe. You won't be able to grow. So I thought, I wonder if I can transfer my skills in in Asia to learn how to grow into Europe, because they have been operating all in the same way for so many years. So when I got to Europe, I looked for the things that were inhibiting them from growing. And I realized that there was tons of growth to be had. They didn't know what to do. So some of it is knowing what you mastered in your country that you can bring to your next country to make something happen, right? It might be risk management, for example. So what Citigroup used to do, it used to move us from country to country because we would have gone through a crisis, and it would say, now you're going to have to do, manage a crisis in this country. So crisis management, risk management is very transferable. Oh, I've seen this before. I know what to do. And I'll give you an example. When I was in the Philippines, we had a 100-year flood, and the whole city was flooded. Now, some people would say, is that really a transferable skill? Well, I remember the business decisions I had to take to make sure that my employees were safe, to work with the rest of the team, etc. Fast forward, I move into Europe and we start having COVID, right? Different situation, but similar problem. We had to keep employees safe. We had an external event, right? I needed to think about how I brought a team together to manage the crisis. So it's not hard skills always, it's soft skills about how you know what to do. And let me give you one principle I've used throughout my entire career, sort of in that never stop learning, is some people like to go very deep in their subject. They become subject matter experts. I like to go very deep and then add a new skill. So for example, in the comms world, you might have media affairs and internal communications, right? So if you become an expert in external media affairs and managing reporters or whatever you're doing, and then somebody says, hey, there's a new job that's internal communications. Take the opportunity because it adds a skill. And then if somebody says, hey, can you run the corporate social responsibility group? Take that job. Why? Because you keep making yourself more relevant to people. Do you see how that works? So I did that in banking. I worked from one department to the next department to the next department, and that allowed me to go up. So I think about it in terms of what can I apply from my last set of experiences that will make me successful in the next set of experiences. That's what I mean by transferable skills. And keep accumulating new areas of mastery. Oh, I've run an internal communications department before, and here's what we did. Oh, I've run a media department, and here's what we did. Oh, I've done the social media page, and this is what we did. Do you see what I mean? All of a sudden, you have a lot to talk about.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to ask a question. You just talked about that you learned diplomacy and then you jump into banking career.
Yeah.
So this is, here is sometimes we see a general fear that moving from one field to another field. For example, if I am working in HR department, just for instance, and my boss or someone else asked me to jump into another finance department or any other department, totally a new field. So there is a fear, hesitation. How to overcome this hesitation and fear?
I try and start with what is similar between the two roles. What is similar between the two roles? Because I personally, and maybe it's because I'm a woman and women tend to be more risk adverse than men, but I would start with what do I already know that I can lean on so that when I move to a new department, I don't start from scratch. Does that make sense? So, and then I find out what do I need to know. So the first thing I always do in a new job that feels unfamiliar is I try and understand what are the, let's call it the four walls of the room of the job. Because then I try and say, okay, how do I organize myself so that I can master all areas of my job? Now, normally I'm assuming my time frame is at least 3 years in that position. Does that make sense? So I know that I'm not going to master all pieces of the new job in the first 6 months. But if I understand what are all the aspects of the duties that I'm going to have, I can then prioritize how I'm going to tackle them. But I start from the foundation that I already have in my last job. So what I found worked best was to have, again, transferability, not going from over here all the way over here. I always tried to find things that were like a derivation of the former job to keep growing. And that seemed to work pretty well. There was one case where I did do the very big jump. And I remember I moved to a new department and I needed to read documents like 5 times through because I didn't understand everything. So the other thing that's about these sorts of moves is you have to recognize that for the first 6 months you're going to be working harder than you did in the last job because you're acquiring knowledge. And so I call it like a curve. You're going up the learning curve. And it's going to take you at least 6 months to feel comfortable if you have a big enough jump, right? But one of the principles is everything you learn, about 70 to 80% is doing a job. It's not going to be, the classroom gets you prepared, but mostly it's going to be doing the job and making mistakes. And so you have to have a risk tolerance to do that. But it's great because once you take the risk, have the courage to take the risk, what's the worst thing that will happen? You fail in the position or you find out it's not good for you as a role, and you can always go back to the thing that you know, potentially. Does that make sense?
Yes, you are absolutely right. It is normally said, no risk, no win.
Yeah.
And some people, especially from countries, where cultural norms and values and generally government position and their education and their teaching method and learning method are not the same as developed countries. And people sometimes fear to take any risk. So how they can overcome this status maybe?
Talk to people. Talk to people who are more senior to you in your organization. Because what I find is knowledge exists. So I'll give you an example of what I would do. I would look at all the departments that made me scared. Okay. All the ones, like, okay, what are they doing in finance and, whatever. And I would ask a junior person for coffee. They say, tell me what you do all day. And I just have a couple questions and I would learn so much. And then it didn't feel so scary anymore. Oh, I might be able to do that. What sort of skills do you need to work in finance, right? In the finance department or in this product department or with that client department. And I was always just sort of trying to make the problem from this big to this big. And I've never had anybody say no to a coffee, as long as I was buying. So a lot of these are trying to demystify the things that are scary to you. And we have Google. When I started, we didn't have Google. So you can also do a lot of your own research to say, what does this look like? Or what have you. Yeah. Yeah.
Ma'am, I firmly believe that the mainstream media will die in the next decade. And how do you perceive independent journalism where we start on digital media platforms? Or should we follow a conventional pathway where we go to media houses and learn? Or should we start with digital platforms like YouTube and Instagram? As you mentioned about AI integration, so there's a lot of knowledge out there that we can personally share with the people, and we don't have to depend on conventional media or television for that or newspaper for that. And you have also seen independent YouTubers, and millions of people are following them. So how do you perceive independent journalism?
It's a great question. Again, if you're thinking about your career, I would obviously recognize the trend towards more social media, etc. But also understand what skills are you really learning, right? So if you think about it from a skills perspective, there might be value of working for, a traditional media outlet and then also working for, let's say an independent outlet, because you need to ask yourself, what are the different skills I'm going to learn in each of those places? And what are the pros and cons of it? Are things, I would think, for example, the independent media might not have as much, let's call it career stability. So you may have to have a little bit more financial security to work in that, right? So weigh the pros and the cons of each of them, but always start with what skills are you developing, again, to be relevant going forward. I think there's a lot of value, obviously, in understanding where the independent media is going. The only thing I would say, and it was a quote I saw this last week, is nobody knows who to trust anymore. That's the biggest issue we have with the independent media explosion. It's overwhelming for people. So I think the real question, and I spent a lot of my own time on this. What's the real story? Who do I trust? How do I understand, this isn't a conspiracy theory or an algorithm trying to make me more extreme in my views, right? So I've also gone to much more primary sources. So I want to understand what this think tank says, not what the journalist is saying about it. Do you see what I mean? What did it actually say? I actually want to listen to the craziness of my president. What did Trump actually say? Not what the media is saying about it. So I think the biggest challenge I see for the media industry is a lack of trust that I think is very international now. So again, when you're thinking about it from your career perspective, maybe even think about what are your own, let's call it journalistic standards, your ethics, right? It's not just about selling newspapers, it's about building trust with your readership. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a great talk. I would like to ask something like you giving a public talk and you start an organization and you NGO and all that stuff. So you're supposed to give that certain agenda. Like you are limited to the content and you are bound to give the impression of that organization. So it might not sound very persuasive, it might lag in the impact. So how can and after all it's your job, so you are supposed to do it. So, like, how can we create an impact in such situations where you're not, honest about the content which you're trying to deliver?
Yeah, it's always hard to represent a position that you don't 100% support. Yeah. There have been times where I've had to deliver the party line, right? Whether it's to a client or to a government or whatever. I think what I try and do is always understand the sides of the argument, the sides of their potential reaction, and come prepared to be as balanced as I can. But what I will never do is compromise my own integrity. And so I think the challenge in all of this is understanding what your red lines are. Does that make sense? Because if you feel like they're asking you to say something you don't believe or isn't true or whatever, then know where those are in advance, and know how far you can go to support it. The hardest thing about character is when you have to make a call, making the call. And I've had to learn the hard way through that. So I'll give you an example. It wasn't really a message, but we had a potential transaction with a rather corrupt family. And my boss had he had a more fluid position than I would like on doing business with this family. And I probably spent 2 or 3 months trying to work out how to tell him I didn't want to work on this because I didn't like the corruption of the family. Probably 2 months too long, but I couldn't quite work it out, right? How do you, to your point, do what the boss wants, but also live by your ethics? And I got to my red line, which is if he's going to fire me for this, I will be fired. That was my red line. And the funny thing is I went in and I said, I'm really uncomfortable working on this transaction and here's why. And he goes, great, I'll work on it. And I was like, okay, that might not be the right decision for the company, but I had worried a long time about this because it had such big consequences for me and my family. But still, it was the right thing to do, was to tell him, I'm not going to go anywhere near this. The good news was the transaction never went ahead, so none of us had to be compromised. And it was because it was a rotten deal at the end of the day. You'll probably be faced with this, and I think deep thinking and contemplation on what your red lines are is really where you need to get to. If you can get your head around the concept, though, and say, look, there's really not an ethical red line I'm crossing here, then you just do your job, right? If you just have a different opinion. But I think typically that's the place where you have to make the call.